I have been obsessed with this map. For a very long time, I'd find any excuse to bring it up in any conversation I had, and discuss it as it genuinely frustrated me. But more on that later. Between the 6th and the 9th of June, 182 million people from 27 different European nations went out to the polls to decide the upcoming European Parliament. Between the National Rally in France, the Alternative for Germany in Germany, the Brothers of Italy, the Reform Party in the UK here in the general election this year, even on other continents in America, in Canada, in Turkey, it is clear that Europeans and developed nations have had enough with immigration. It seems to be what people think are the biggest drain on the European economy. What sounds a bit crazy is, as an immigrant, I can understand. You don't need to be an immigrant or born in that country to understand it either. Conversations surrounding immigration are rarely done honestly or in good faith, making one out to be either a loony hipster who wants open borders, or a racist fascist who wants to deport every single person with any colour in their skin. And it is always used as a scapegoat by the media. I will be using the example of the United Kingdom, as obviously that is what I have the most experience with. But everything I say is surprisingly consistent with countries that have a colonial past, such as Black and Hispanic people in the United States, Northern and Western African people in France and Spain, and Turks, Roma, Jews, and Eastern Europeans in Germany, alongside many other examples through history. Every single time the economy goes badly, consistently, blame is cast to the bottom of society as opposed to those in power who actually caused it. You want to feed your family? Well, they should just buy the Tesco value option.
Heinz Bakery, I mean, say the price has shot up at that and people say, oh, this tin has gone up by 50% or whatever, buy the Tesco value one.
The poor need to just learn how to cook and budget.
I think you'll see firsthand that there's not this massive use for food banks in this country. We've got generation after generation who cannot cook properly, they can't cook a meal from scratch, they cannot budget. The challenge is there. Come.
The poor are simply too picky with what they eat. That's the problem. You want clean rivers? My generation swam in literal human waste.
But yeah, no, it's a problem. I'm not absolutely not denying that it is a big issue. But it always has been. It's interesting. I mean, I remember as a child in South Wales,
swimming in sewage.
Swimming in sewage, absolutely. Oh yeah, Jackson's Bay in Barry used to be a sewage outlet where we all went and paddled and swam.
You're too entitled. It's all that pronoun woke stuff. That's the problem. You want to heat your homes? Blame the Eastern Europeans for getting your bills up. Not the government, which has spent over a decade doing nothing to insulate our homes, despite having the worst housing stock in all of Europe. You want housing? Well, it's not the fault of the government, which has consistently failed to meet its building targets year after year. For decades, kept regulation too difficult. Look, it's those immigrants over there coming over. That's why housing is so expensive.
From me. After PMQs today, Parliament entered into a 5-hour debate on levelling up and in particular on a shortage of housing. Not one member of Parliament in a 5-hour debate made the connection, made the link between the lack of social housing in this country and the fact that net migration means we need to build 750 new houses every single day.
And the media just eats it up. So let's just have an honest discussion around the benefits and drawbacks of immigration, with research and stats to back it up, not just emotional talking points, or a news headline of an immigrant, a black man or a Muslim man committing some kind of crime, or schools supposedly teaching hate of the white race, which they're not. It's detached from reality, because if you get one news headline a day of a particular demographic causing a crime, over the year you'll have seen that crime be committed by that demographic 365 times. You'll have any reader emotionally thinking it's an epidemic from that demographic, based entirely off their emotions and not looking at the actual stats. Despite the fact that the number of crimes a year can be up to 8.8 million. Is it any wonder that people who read newspapers that bang on about immigration or wokeism think immigration and woke culture are the biggest problems in the country? Is it any surprise that those who read newspapers or social media accounts that bang on about the climate crisis or LGBT stuff have those at the top of their agenda? It's called an echo chamber, and it is extremely dangerous no matter what side of the aisle you're on. What the media and those who spread disinformation do is called cherry picking, such as using an outlier case of a teacher getting fired for misgendering a student. This is not being honest, because we don't make policy decisions based off emotions and outliers, but based off of evidence, stats, and data. So let's dive into the case for and against immigration. What's interesting is most people don't actually disagree that much over immigration as much as the media would like you to think. As much as I don't want to entertain both extreme sides of open borders and no immigration at all, I'm trying to cover this entire topic, so bear with me please. It's quite easy to discuss both extremes actually. On one hand, we definitely need immigration because we're an aging society and we also have a skills deficiency in our workforce. And even if we were to focus on plugging it organically, it would not be plugged in time. Think how many vacancies you have of doctors and nurses. We can look out to countries like China, Korea, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and especially Japan. Countries which are not just aging, but also have pretty much no immigration to them. These countries have very low fertility rates, some far beyond the replacement rate of 2.1, such as Korea with a 0.9 replacement rate. This means that the newborn population halves every single generation. In Japan, they sell more adult diapers than baby diapers. That's how bad it's become. So why do we need immigration? In one word, economics. Or demographics. There's a lot of words I can use, that's not the point. China imposed its famous one-child policy after imposing a two-child policy, but has now scrapped it and is scrambling to get its population to have more kids, but it's too late. South Korea is getting even more desperate, creating a whole government-funding dating app in order to get the fertility rate back up. Ukraine are dead if they lose the war, but they're dead even if they win the war. Look at their population pyramid. They peaked in 1993 and have been falling ever since. The same is with Poland in 1998, Hungary in 1980, Japan in 2008, and especially Russia in 1992. That means that their population will only ever get smaller, and it'll be the young workers who drive economic growth who are lost over time, either due to decreasing fertility or emigration. Have a look at this map. It shows which countries are above and below the replacement rate of 2.1 kids per woman. The countries in blue are below 2.1, and should they not change something quickly, either with increasing fertility or immigration, are in for a rude awakening. And you may even notice countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, France, and Germany on there below the replacement rate. But they've had such levels of migration that actually offset this drop in fertility rate. Immigrant families also tend to adapt to the native fertility rate after 1 or 2 generations, so it's not a permanent change. The double whammy is with countries like Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, because not only do they have a decreasing fertility rate, but they also have net emigration out of the country, as young people seek to leave the country for economic opportunities, which means the population is going down from 2 different reasons. This causes an irreversible spiral where young people leave the country due to its economic decline, which causes the economy to suffer more, which causes young people to flee even more, and so on and so on. So in summary, we do not want to be in the position of Poland, Japan, China, and definitely not Russia. What's interesting is that the fertility rate has actually dropped below the replacement rate. In 1970 in Germany, 2 years later in the United States, a year later in the United Kingdom, a year later in France, a year later in Australia, and so on. So how have countries managed to grow both the populations and economies in the same time, despite having a lower fertility rate? Well, it's in the title of the video. All of these countries experienced a surge of immigration, mostly from colonies or closely linked nations, an amount which helped keep the economies afloat and rising. Without such, we would have met the same fate as our friends in the East, or Eastern Europe. Some may look at the case of Japan, China, and South Korea and think that's not so bad. But it will take some time for the effects of having no working age population to actually make money for the retired, though they've already started to show. The Japanese Prime Minister at the time said in January 2023 that Japan is standing on the verge of whether we can continue to function as a society, and they are said to have a shortcoming of 11 million workers by 2040. In China, 300 million workers are set to leave the workforce in the next decade, which is their biggest labor force demographic. That's the equivalent of every single American of all ages and backgrounds going from being economically productive members of society and paying a surplus of taxes to the government, to becoming pensioners and a net drain on the country's finances. So what's preventing us from being like them? As the World Economic Forum said, some experts say that without relaxing Japan's strict immigration laws, filling that labour gap will be a slow burn. There will soon be a time when the Western world will be fighting over immigrants. A time when they will have to import more migrants in order to save their ageing society. We already have 2 advantages over the Far East, which is that we're not suffering from the consequence from the decline in fertility rates, but we're also far more accepting of the idea of immigration to begin with. A concept which is not looked at so favourably in those countries, both the Far East and Eastern Europe. So immigration is perfect and leads to eternal economic growth. Yes? Well, obviously not quite the case. To discuss the other extreme of open all borders, the easiest way to think about it is if you were to double your population overnight magically. The easiest way to think about it is if you were to magically double your population overnight, would it lead to a magical doubling in your productive capacity? No, of course not. Because then you need more housing, more jobs, more products, more infrastructure. So what's the magical amount that we can bring in? What's the sweet spot? Well, there isn't quite a specific number we can look at, but we can judge year on year. If this number of immigrants has helped this country benefit, then maybe increasing it could help. If it hasn't, then maybe decreasing it could help. Let me show you this graph. A graph which shows that most people in this country actually think more similarly on immigration than the media would like us to think. This was an opinion poll done earlier this year, released on the 24th of March 2024. It shows how people view changing migration levels of different groups. And what we can see is that most people want more doctors, nurses, care workers, skilled workers, such as in IT and scientists. They're generally more favourable of refugees and asylum seekers, though worryingly, it does matter where they come from. people are generally more okay with refugees coming from Hong Kong than Afghanistan, and more okay with Ukrainian refugees than those two countries as well, despite the fact that you'd say that the British directly caused the Afghan refugee crisis. Call me crazy, but if someone's life is in danger, the first thing we don't look at is skin colour. This chart does show that people pay more attention to skills and demand of the workers rather than their place of origin, where high-skilled workers from India and Poland were similar to each other, and far higher to low-skilled workers from India and Poland, who also had similar rates of acceptance. But in general, as a matter of principle, most people are okay with having more in-demand groups such as doctors, nurses, and IT workers coming to the country, and are generally okay with those fleeing violence coming in as well. They just want fewer smaller boat crossings. I discussed the entire solution to the small boat crossings and immigration numbers in general in this video if you want to have a watch. Well, what about claims that immigration leads to a deterioration of public services like the health service, transportation, and housing? Well, the Home Office actually ran a migration advisory committee, which concluded that there is no doubt that EEA members contribute more to the health service than they take out. This research paper done by the Health Foundation found that contrary to the dominant narrative around migration in recent years, the research evidence, including our study, has consistently shown that recent arrivals to the UK use the NHS less than the UK-born population. This paper done by the University of Oxford shows that immigration numbers actually reduced waiting times for patient referrals. A 10% increase in the share of migrants living in a local authority would reduce waiting times by 9 days on average, and there is no effect of immigration on A&E waiting times or elective care. As for the NHS workforce itself, it's disproportionately made up of non-British and non-white workers, aka immigrants, the children of immigrants, and the grandchildren of immigrants. 19% of the NHS workforce is not British, compared to 16% of the general population. There are differences in the ethnicities of different specialties in the NHS, but all specialties have a larger share of non-white workers than the wider working age population. HCHS doctors, which include consultants and these roles, are disproportionately Asian and black. The share of doctors in the NHS, and especially junior doctors, are made up of a higher proportion of ethnic minorities than white people. Put simply, non-white and non-British workers are significantly overrepresented in the NHS workforce and uses services less than the native-born population. Well, what about claims that immigrants drain public finances and public services? Well, here's the net amount that non-EEA immigrants put into the system, and here's the amount for EEA immigrants. What you'll notice is both are positive, meaning that even after factoring in benefits and tax credits, we still make all these billions a year extra from their payments. As for transport, this research paper from the RAND Corporation shows that migrants travel less often, and mainly for work, than those born in the UK. They also tend to live in big metropolitan areas where public transport is widely available and used, such as London. They also use non-car modes of transport, such as walking and cycling. Given enough time, normally 6 years or more, they assimilate to the native usage of normal transport. Okay, housing. Don't immigrants drive up housing prices and take up all the social housing? Well, when we compare the UK-born and foreign-born, we can see that they use social housing at similar rates, meaning that they are not taking up most of the council houses, as some papers insinuate. They do have lower home ownership rates, which means that they do end up renting more often than natives. Again, cherry picking has been done on this subject, such as The Sun making the claim that almost half of all social housing in London is consumed by those not born in the UK, which is a bit misleading because almost half of all people in London are not born in the UK. So it's actually pretty proportional. And then another claim that 3/4 of Somali households are on social housing. Well, first off, that doesn't account for the fact that whether they were born in this country or not, so technically still British. And second off, the Somali population is 70,000 in a city of almost 10 million people. They also disproportionately use social housing more than many other ethnicities. Again, cherry picking. When you're looking at the wider context of all different ethnicities and backgrounds in different cities, this just simply does not hold up. Put simply, The Sun and many other newspapers are cherry picking their stats. As for housing prices, the University of Oxford claims that its findings are not uniform. For example, they claim that the Migration Advisory Committee said in 2018 that a 1% increase in immigration numbers led to a 1% increase in housing prices, but included this very big disclaimer, which The Sun conveniently does not mention. 2010 data from 170 different local authorities across England and Wales found that an increase of 1% in the immigrant population reduced house prices by 1.7%. Whatever the analysis ends up finding, we can see that house prices have had a different trend from immigration trends. Here's the trend of net migration from 1992, and this is how house prices have fared in comparison to average earnings. Of course, immigration, the general population levels, is going to be a factor in determining how house prices go up and down. It's one of the elements that drives demand. But when people blame immigration as the main or only issue of why house prices are going up, they are looking at one element of one factor that drives house prices, like housing supply and demand, public and private cooperation, internal and external investment in purchasing, cultural shifts, and so much more. My vision is that we design such an ideal system that we mitigate all the downsides of immigration while using all the positives, which could include building a lot more housing in order to supply this demand. Also, if you like this video or have found it interesting, a subscribe would be great. Okay, we've covered the economic points. What about assimilation? Immigrant enclaves inside bigger cities, creating no-go zones for the native population. How do we tackle those? Is that not a problem? Well, Yes and no. I really think that the media pushes this narrative too much, and I don't just mean the mainstream media, but also social media and its echo chambers and algorithms. It's easy to point to areas like Coventry Road, Wilmslow Road, Edgware Road, Brixton, Bradford, and claim that they're areas of no-go zones where white people are not safe to go. But in reality, that's just not what most of the country experiences. If you go outside and meet someone from a different background, no matter where they are from the country, have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you, who comes from a different religious or ethnic or whatever background, or even just have a job that requires you to interact with a lot of these people, and have honest conversations when you can, you will soon seem to realize that the problem is way overblown. Social media algorithms favor posts which push people into extreme forms of thinking and extreme emotions, normally anger, which means that this kind of content is favored. The problem is not going away anytime soon. And when I say problem, I don't mean immigration, I mean integration, or lack thereof, if and where it exists. But it needs to be evidence-based. Stories will be thrown around of no-go areas for white people, or Jews thanks to South Asia, or Turkish barbers running money laundering or tax evasion schemes by mainstream media outlets and politicians, which are all unfounded or severely exaggerated. And that's just the mainstream media. Imagine what the echo chambers are spewing online. So how do you judge what's true and what to be discarded? Well, the most basic guideline is to look at, is this idea based off of any evidence? And you think this is pretty standard, but unfortunately it's not. But that's not enough. We also need to see if this claim is supported by the wider data. Again, plaster a hypothetical brown man or black man onto the newspapers every single day for a year with some crime they've committed, and people will think that brown and black men are more prone to crime, despite the fact that there's not that strong of a correlation between ethnicity and crime, but overwhelmingly linked to poverty and crime. And arrest rates have actually been going down recently. Hell, many people think there's a Pakistani grooming epidemic going on because of dodgy media reporting. Good video discussing the reporting and debunking the claims is this video over here. It's honestly a great piece of analysis. But again, we need to analyze opinions based off of evidence and stats, not based off emotions or hearsay. So what does the data show about integration and assimilation? And what does that mean for British society? Well, when it comes to the common media punching bag of Muslims, the Muslim Council of Britain ran the numbers of the 2021 census and found that 51% of Muslims are actually born in this country, with 90% of them being fluent in English, or considering it their first language. This is how the first or second language barrier looks like, where most groups contain 85 to 95% of their members being able to communicate with no problem, either with English as a first language or a second. A significant 75% of Muslims also identify as British, compared to 86% of the general population, who identify either as British, English, or both. As to all immigrants, only 10% of them cannot speak English well. 41% of them have a degree level qualification or higher, compared to 25% of the general population. And this is what the length of residence looks like broken down. A good indicator of remaining invested in community is home ownership rates, as you've literally bought a piece of land in that community. Migrant communities obviously tend to have lower home ownership rates than those born in this country. After all of them have come to this country with not much setup. But what's interesting is that the rate actually climbs up over the duration of their stay, until they equal at about 20 years and more of residence, which shows that this all just takes time. In 2018, only about 10% of local authorities had a foreign-born population of 25% or more. What the University of Oxford's Migration Observatory mentions is that as migrants spend more time in the UK, they report a decreased sense of connection with the city or region where they grew up. Nearly 9 in 10 migrants who have been in the UK for up to 5 years consider the place where they grew up to be very important. After 15 years in the UK, less than half feel the same. However, the opposite does not appear to hold. A migrant's identification with the current place of residence in the UK does not appear to change over time. Participation in local clubs, events and membership is also another good sign of integration, as you're getting more involved with the local community. As the data shows, after 10 years of residing in the UK, migrants end up with the same levels of civic participation, such as being a member of the local organisation or volunteering as native-born Brits. Immigrants also have more diverse friend groups than natives, showing that they try to befriend beyond their own ethnic background. Here we can see that, interestingly, those who report being a group that is discriminated against always have the highest percentages being those who are born in the UK to foreign-born parents, aka the children of immigrants who have been raised in this country. Now, it is important to point out that most people do not report being part of a discriminated group, with only 16% reporting so. But then it begs the question, why are people who are born in this country to immigrant parents reporting being discriminated against the most? Well, here is where things get a bit more subjective. And this is where we collide with the earlier idea of communities lacking integration, such as the towns in Bradford, Birmingham, London, and other major metropolitan areas, with big Pakistani, Albanian, and Bulgarian communities in there, and any other communities which refuse to integrate. The narrative is that they create no-go areas, essentially turn the area into a little Pakistan, Albania, or Bulgaria. Whilst I can't offer any concrete solutions or stats, as it is pretty much impossible to find anything relevant, what I can offer is perspective. Which brings me back to this map. This is actually a map of the ethnic makeup of Bradford, which I'd bring up to my South Asian friends, especially those from Bradford themselves. I found multiple cities and compared, but Bradford was what stood out to me in particular. I bring this forward to my friends who complained that this was basically self-segregation. Why would we want this? And what I found is that the more I spoke to them, the more I understood why this happened. When families migrated from South Asia in the 1960s and 70s, they faced a lot of racism and discrimination. They were shunned out of communities, faced verbal and violent acts of racism, and were even institutionally discriminated against by housing developers, landlords, and councils. Those that lived through that time described the experience of having bricks going through their windows, finding all sorts of things in their letterboxes. And the random acts of violence that you'd find across the street were not limited to any time of day, and were done to man, woman, child, and the elderly. The police as well were not interested in patrolling and protecting these communities, which meant that the only safe option was to live in their own collectivized communities. Strong family links in a lot of non-Western European cultures, especially South Asian cultures, also means that extended families tend to want to live in close proximity of each other. The famous case of the Bengali squatter movement in London in the 60s and 70s, which was sparked after years of discrimination, oppression, and violence, was published. And I know after speaking to my own friends who were born in this country but are children of immigrants or grandchildren of immigrants, is that they were never made to feel British, and that Britain was never made to feel as if it was their home. And this is the story of many countries, especially France, from my experience. And again, I'm not just talking about those who have been here for 5, 10, and 15 years. I'm talking about second and third generation immigrants who have been born here and know no other language or country other than the United Kingdom and English. They've just seen so much discrimination both on their parents, their grandparents, and their own parts, and go through systemic, verbal, and physical violence and racism. They all have stories. They all have opportunities that they missed out on due to their ethnicity and background. They all have opportunities that they missed out on due to the colour of their skin. And they all have reasons which made them self-segregate into these communities. And this is how we get cities and communities like this. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I'm saying that after learning this, as a self-defense tactic, it's very understandable of why this ended up happening. We all agree integration and assimilation is a very important part of immigration into this country. And it seems that generally, most immigrants do end up assimilating well into the communities, especially in recent years. But I've seen that a lot of these cultural hotspots, such as Bradford and Birmingham, tend to get a lot of the media attention, especially when done by South Asians, as it's just a very easy target. And this just ends up causing more division between communities, which is the last thing we need right now. What's important to do is just hear each other out, empathize with each other, have difficult conversations with people. Because not only is it in no one's interest to live in a divided and fractured community, but no one even wants that. They want to be treated without hostility. People of all backgrounds want to feel comfortable in the communities they live in. They want to feel respected. They want to feel safe. At the end of the day, everyone just wants to go out and make a living for their family, regardless of your background. Those that are raised with friends and influences from different backgrounds tend to be the most tolerant on these lines. You're less likely to hold racist views, even if they're not overtly racist, if you have friends from those groups, which makes sense once you say it out loud. If you have Muslim friends, you feel less frightened of Islam, especially if you end up asking questions about Islam or reading into it yourself. So what's the solution? Well, it's never too late to go out and befriend someone or to go out and meet someone from a different background. Get to know people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, cultures. Ask them why they're here. Ask them their experiences of their families, of themselves. Learn about their desires and their goals and their personality and what they want to provide for the country. If you feel uncertain or nervous to do so, ask yourself why. If you're afraid of certain groups or might feel a bit uncomfortable around them, just ask yourself why. It might be because you've had little exposure to them apart from what the media likes to show you. Getting to know them, even if they form just a polite, distant relationship, often helps those worries melt away. We need more dialogue between communities. Because if we're all ignorant of each other and play into the game that those in power like to put us into, we will never begin to see the real cause of the problem. Those in power, the elites, the politicians, the media moguls, the billionaires. If we divide and fight amongst ourselves, we will never see who the real enemy is.
The Daily Mail front page reports that Keir Starmer has taken down a picture of Margaret Thatcher and presumably replaced it with something he likes looking at. That's the front page of the best-selling newspaper in the United Kingdom. So if you think I exaggerate when I tell you that brain-dead right-wing mouthpieces are dedicated to making you angry about things that you shouldn't even care about one jot, there's the front page of the Daily Mail for you.